Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens monologue, where we don't just react to the headlines, we break down the deeper systems driving what you're seeing in real time. Today, we're going beyond the surface of viral incidents and asking a bigger question. Why does it feel like public violence, especially stabbings, is happening more often, and why does it feel more unpredictable than ever? This isn't just about fear, it's about understanding patterns, and once you see the patterns, you can't unsee it. I've been paying close attention to the headlines and the clips going viral and the conversations people are having. And there's a clear shift in how people are reacting to public violence, and it's just concerns anymore. It's frustration, confusion, and for some people, a real sense that things are starting to break down. But when I started digging into the data and the patterns behind these incidents, I realized something important. What we're seeing isn't just sudden spike in violence, it's a shift in visibility, location, and the type of incidents that are capturing our attention. Violent crime in the United States has never been a simple, straightforward trend. It rises, falls, and shifts depending on economic conditions, policy changes, and social factors. While certain years there have been spikes, especially around 2020, 2021, more recent data shows stabilization or even decline in some areas. But that doesn't mean people feel safer, and that gap between data and perception is where the conversations really begins. One of the biggest reasons for the gap is the nature of the incident themselves. Knife related attacks, especially in public settings, feel different than other types of crime because they are close contact, personal, and often chaotic. There aren't distant events, they happen face to face in real time in places people move through every single day. And that changes how people internalize the risk. When these incidents hit the news, they're almost always labeled as random, and that word carries weight. It suggests unpredictability and lack of motive, and the idea that anyone could be next. But when you step back and actually look for the data and case pattern, you start to see the true randomness is far less common than it's made out to be. A large percentage of violent incidents involves people who know each other in some capacity, whether it's relationship, a past conflict, or an ongoing dispute. Even in cases where the victim and the attacker don't know each other personally, there is often still a context, an argument, a perceived slight, or a moment of escalation that turns violent. What gets reported as random is often just a situation where the backstory wasn't immediately visible to the public. That's where the concept of the hidden buildup becomes critical. Many of the incidents are not spontaneous, they are the result of escalating behavior that went unchecked over time, and one of the most consistent pipelines into public violence is domestic conflict. Domestic violence is one of the most widespread and under-discussed drivers of escalation in the country. Millions of people experience it, and it often follows a pattern that experts have been documenting for decades. It starts with control, manipulation, and emotional pressure, then it escalates into a physical violence, and over time, the severity and frequency tend to increase. And what makes this even more dangerous is that there are often multiple warning signs before things reach a breaking point. Police may have been called before reports may have been filed, restraining orders may have been issued, and yet the situation continues to evolve. The system responds in moments, but it rarely stays involved long enough to fully stabilize the situation. One of the most critical and dangerous phases in the domestic situation is the separation. When one person tries to leave, the dynamic shifts, and someone who thrives on control, that loss can trigger extreme behavior. And this is where many of the most serious and violent incidents occur. And it's also where private conflict often spills into public spaces. We've seen this play out in workplaces, transit systems, and everyday environments where people who are confronted by a person they are trying to get away from. From the outside, it looks like a sudden, unprovoked attack, but in reality, it's often the final escalation of something that had been building for a long time, and that time it reaches that point, intervention becomes much more difficult to control. Now, layered on top of that is the issue of mental health, and this is where the conversation requires real balance and a clarity. The majority of people dealing with mental health challenges are not violent, and they are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. But there is a smaller subset of cases where untreated or severe conditions, especially when combined with substance abuse or prior instability, can increase the likelihood of unpredictable and sometimes dangerous behavior. The real issue isn't just mental illness, it's a gap in consistent long-term care. Decades ago, the United States moved away from large institutional facilities with the goal of transitioning to the community-based treatment centers. On paper, that sounded like progress, but in practice, the infrastructure needed to support that shift was never fully developed. What we are left with today is fragmented systems where people can access the short term help, but they struggle to find sustained support. Emergency rooms can stabilize someone in crises, but they are not designed for long term treatment, and voluntary holds are limited in duration and require strict legal thresholds to expand or extend. And when someone is released from it, they often return to the same environment that contributed to the crises in the first place. Now, this position creates what many professionals refer to as a revolving door. The person enters the system during a crisis, receives the temporary care, exits the system, and eventually winds up in another crisis. Each cycle increases the risk of the escalation, especially if there are additional stressors like housing instability, substance abuse, or unresolved personal conflicts. And at the same time, law enforcement is increasingly positioned as a front line for situations they were never fully equipped to manage. Officers respond to domestic disputes and mental health crises and unpredictable behavior in public spaces. But their role is inherently reactive. They can intervene in the moment, but they don't have the authority to the resources to provide long-term care. This is where a lot of the public's frustration begins to make sense. People see repeat incidents, familiar patterns, and individuals who seem to cycle through the system without lasting change. It creates the perceptions that nothing is being done, even though multiple systems are involved at different stages. The reality is, these systems of law enforcement, mental health services, and the court operate independently from each other, and they have their own roles and limitations and responsibilities. There is no single point of accountability for preventing escalation across all three. That lack of coordination is also where many cases fall apart. Now add it all to this role of media and technology, and you start to understand why fear is rising, even in an area where crime data may not show dramatic increases. Social media platforms amplify the most intense, emotional, and shocking content, often pushing it to millions of people within hours. These clips don't just inform, they immerse you in the moment. And when people repeatedly see footage of violent incidents happening in familiar environments, it also changes how they perceive risk. It's no longer abstract and it becomes something they can visualize happening to them, and psychologically, that kind of exposure has a powerful effect on how safe or unsafe the world feels. This is known as the availability effect, where people estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall examples of it. And right now, those examples are everywhere. Even if the overall risk hasn't skyrocketed, the perception of risk absolutely has. So, when you step back and connect all these layers, domestic escalation, mental health gaps, system fragmentation, and media amplification, you start to see a much clearer picture. These incidents are not isolated and they are purely random. They are the result of multiple factors converging at the same time. This is what I would call the collision point, where an individual in crisis, a history of conflict, and a lack of sustained intervention all intersect in a public setting And when that collision happens, it creates the kind of incident that dominates headlines and shapes public perception. The real issue isn't just what happens in that final moment, it's everything that happened leading up to it. The missed opportunities for intervention, the temporary fixes instead of long term solutions, and the lack of coordination between the systems that are supposed to protect the people that's where the deeper problems exist. So instead of asking why these attacks keep happening, maybe the better question is how many chances there were to prevent them before they ever reach that point. Because once you start looking at it that way, it at least becomes clear that the system didn't just fail in one moment. It failed over and over again in a smaller ways that eventually added up. If you made it this far, you already understand this isn't just about one incident, one headline, or one city. It's about a bigger pattern that's playing out right in front of us. If you found value in this deep dive, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep breaking down the real issues that others won't touch. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Peace.